Waterfall, the CCW podcast.
Hello and welcome to Waterfall. It's the podcast that dives into the big questions about water, why it matters, and what you can do to protect this precious resource. Waterfall is brought to you by CCW, that's the Consumer Council for Water. I'm Mike Keel, and I'm delighted to say that joining us is Karen Gibbs, who's CCW's water resource expert. Now, Karen is a familiar voice to listeners of Waterfall because she has co-hosted many of our episodes. Karen, in her professional life, helps to shape the water sector's approach to drought and water supply resilience, and she has a vast knowledge on the environmental challenges that we face. She really is a water guru. Today, Karen's going to help us unpack why wet winters are so crucial for our water supplies and what's really happening with our water resources and what we can all do to help make a difference. So let's get started. Let's bring on the guest. Karen, welcome back to Waterfall. Hello.
Hello there, Mike.
It's nice to have you back. I was going to say long time no see, but I actually saw you like 2 days ago. But look, let's just dive straight in. We often hear that we need a wet winter, but why does a wet winter matter when it comes to our water resources?
Well, I think, it's worth having a think about where our water comes from. And it's important to note, I think, that although we all automatically think of things like rivers and streams, there's also a lot of our water supply that comes from underground sources. So, which is called groundwater, not unsurprisingly, but it's one of those things where different parts of the country are going to be seeing recovery from drought at different rates, simply because, when you look at the weather forecasts, on after the evening news and things like that, there's often a pattern of weather that comes up from the Atlantic, hits the west of the UK, and then travels up to the northwest, and that means that the rate of recovery is different in different parts of the UK. So one of the things that I think people don't realise is that in the south of England, the majority of our water supply comes from those underground porous rocks that are in effect aquifers. And the groundwater, therefore, is a really important part of the recovery of our supplies. And water companies and the Environment Agency really wait until our water stocks are where they should be at any particular time of year before they will say that a drought is over.
So that was a helpful primer on like where our water comes from. That a lot of it is groundwater. It's not just all about reservoirs. But what about wet winters? I mean, you described Atlantic storms, which is obviously our prevailing weather system. But why is the winter season so crucial there?
Well, I think, as we go into this autumn, we've had a period of time that has been consistently lower than average rainfall. So the ground conditions have really changed. The ground has dried out in effect, and it's going to take quite a while before something called the soil moisture deficit is fully recovered. And that's basically the degree to which water can start soaking into the ground and replenishing those underground stocks. So it's really important that people recognise that just because we've had, a couple of weeks of quite wet weather, it's going to take well into the autumn and over the winter to really allow a full recovery to where things should be at this particular time of year.
So, I mean, I was looking at the rainfall stats, and you do see that there's significantly higher rainfall in the winter than there is in the summer. And obviously we rely on that to recharge our aquifers, the groundwater essentially, and our rivers and our reservoirs. I was just looking at stats. So Cardiff gets 1.2 meters of rainfall a year. 14 centimeters on average falls in December, but only 7 centimeters in June. So you can see that the winter period is really crucial there, because that's obviously when most of the rainfall arrives. And I was looking at other parts of the country, because I think people forget Britain is very diverse. England and Wales are very diverse in terms of rainfall patterns. Like Norwich, in contrast to Cardiff, it gets 0.7 of a meter a year. So that's, just over half of what Cardiff gets. And it gets 7 centimeters, 7.1 centimeters on average in November, but only about 6 in June. So the variability is less between the months, but still it's the autumn winter months that they rely on. I went up north, had a look at Durham. I was surprised at this. Durham gets roughly the same as Norwich. For some reason I had in my head that Durham would be a lot wetter than Norwich, but it isn't. It's roughly about the same. And again, November was the wettest month, 7.3 centimeters of rain, and January, similar to Norwich, was the driest at 5.2 centimeters. I was surprised. I thought the summer would be the driest, but still, it does show that you rely on that autumn winter period for replenishing those stocks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is a huge misconception that, we are a really sort of wet country, and quite clearly, there is a very patchy picture in terms of the recovery from drought. And one of the things that, I'm very conscious of is the fact that, we've seen some really significant impacts this year, particularly in relation to the environment as well. And, a lot of the challenges that the water companies have in meeting these drought conditions is because of the huge spike in water use that happens as temperatures rise. Now, that's understandable, you could argue. The problem is that it makes it even more challenging because the more water we're all using, the more is coming out of the environment. And, that has an impact on habitats and the wider sort of environment areas and wildlife. It also has an impact on things like agriculture, where we've seen, some real challenges for farmers, both in terms of livestock and crop growing. So, the impacts go much wider than just the public water supply.
Yes, and you're painting quite an interesting picture here, because when we think about water supply, it is not just about rainfall. That is clearly one of the key factors, but it's about rainfall. And as you talked about earlier, it's about the local geography and geology. Is it the type of rock and the type of aquifer, the big sponge that can hold water underground, and also crucially, as you just said, how much people use, and that equation means that you get quite a different picture depending on where you are across England and Wales, and what your sort of local geography is like. I was really interested in the episode we did, episode 93, which is a couple of episodes ago, where you had Stuart Sampson on from the Environment Agency. He was an excellent guest, really informative episode. Obviously, we have quite a sophisticated planning process in place in England for managing droughts. Now, we do plan, don't we, to be able to cope with a drier winter. It's not that you have one dry winter and then that's it, we're done.
No, absolutely. The variability in weather conditions is something that, water companies have had to plan for years, But the important thing is that companies plan for different rainfall scenarios. So, EA and the water companies are constantly in dialogue about what the prevailing weather conditions are, what they could be going forward into next year, and how companies need to respond to those potential conditions. So it's really important, I think, that people take comfort from the fact that we do have these really rigorous planning processes in place, but recognizing at the same time that we all have a part to play in that. Because as I said earlier, the more we're using, the more of a challenge it is for the companies to strike the balance between protecting local environmental conditions and also keeping their customers in supply. And, it's a constant balancing act, in effect.
I'm sure some people might be listening to this going, winter droughts, what's that about? I mean, I originally was a meteorologist, so I understand a drought can come at any time of year. But I think a lot of people, and this is completely understandable, associate drought with hot, dry, sunny weather. You kind of alluded to it yourself a few minutes ago. Do you think that concept of a winter drought is something that people find hard just to kind of recognise and comprehend?
I think it will be. And one of the things that I think we're going to have to start planning for, over and above what we already planned for, is the fact that we are going to see more of these extremes. So, it's very likely that we could still be in drought at a time where we're seeing really intense rainfall causing flooding, and those are the sorts of extreme swings in weather that are unfortunately going to be part of the picture going forward.
And that's an interesting point, that we built a system for collecting water in the UK that was, started off in Victorian, Edwardian times, based on the conditions that were seen then. And now, as you've said, rain is actually falling in different ways. And therefore, the system that we've built and relied on over many years actually might now not be optimized, and probably isn't optimized, truth be told, to match the way that rain actually arrives these days. Is that a fair point to make, or have I missed the mark there?
No, I mean, I think that is right. And, we are going to have to start looking at things like building homes that are much more water efficient. We are going to have to consider new ways of producing water, whether that be desalination or recycling. There will be, some real big challenges going forward. And it's important that the water industry is prepared and able to meet those challenges.
Now, we're obviously recording this in October 2025, and as you've been saying, we've had some challenges this year, and you've seen some impacts, not just on public water supply, but you've seen some impacts affecting the environment, affecting agriculture, your culture too. How quickly do you think things could turn around? And I suppose I've got this thing in my head from 2012 where it was very dry at the start of the year and everyone started getting all jumpy because the Olympics, and oh no, what if there was water problems during the Olympics, water restrictions. And then I think people were calling it the wettest drought on record.
Yes, I remember that only too well.
And like within what felt like a very short time, everything was finding back to normal. I mean, how quickly can things turn around?
As I say, a lot depends on what the weather conditions we get over the autumn and winter. So if we are fortunate enough, and I use these terms with some degree of hesitation because I know people don't really like the wet winters, but if we do get 100% of what we would expect to get over the winter period of rainfall, that would be probably enough to sort things out in effect. But if we get less than that, then clearly it's going to take that bit longer, particularly for the drier parts of the country, to really fully recover from an environmental point of view, but also from a public supply point of view as well.
So we've got this combination of effects, as far as I can see, that you've got what's gone before really matters. So if you've had a dry summer or a dry start to the year, dry spring, dry summer, and then an average winter, that might not be enough. You might need even more. It's that combination, cumulative effect.
Yeah. And of course, once we get into the spring and the temperatures start to rise and conditions, therefore sort of move on again, we have to ensure that enough water is in reserve to meet the needs of the population.
Now, I'm sure, if you're listening to this and you're kind of hearing, we're talking a lot about rainfall and why it really matters. And of course it does matter. But I think it'd be a fair challenge to us to say, well, okay, Mike and Karen, why bother saving water? If it's just the weather, why should we bother? Well,
I go back to the point I made earlier. This is about us recognizing that, we do have a part to play because the water that we're using on a daily basis is coming out of those rivers and streams, etc., and the underground sources that, and the more we're taking, that less is going to be left in the environment. And that has an impact on wildlife, habitats, other sectors. So agriculture, as we've talked about already. So, it's one of those things where I think we need to sort of take a step back sometimes and see the big picture.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, using less means that reservoirs, aquifers, rivers fill up faster when the rains do come. And also by using less means that we're keeping more water in the environment. So the water we do have will go further. And it's a fairly simple equation. So, that is why it does, what we do does matter, as well as what the weather does, of course. Now, we touched on this a little bit. Dry winters are actually becoming less common. So that's good news if you look at the climate predictions. So in fact, Met Office data, love the Met Office. Met Office data shows that 6 out of the 10 wettest October to March periods, so that 6 month period, have happened this century. And that, get this, that's a record. It dates back to 1767. Wow. So that's incredible, though. That record, it goes back to 1767, and 6 of the 10 wettest 6 month October to March periods have been this century. So we are seeing those changes. So what does that mean then for sort of the way we plan for water resources in the context of climate change? Because on the face of it, people could say, "Wow, job done, you guys. It's getting easier."
Well, I think it's one of the things that we have to start doing is to plan a lot more holistically. So seeing the opportunities to harness the winter rainfall that we do get to ensure that it isn't just running out to sea, and, people will probably have heard that there are something like 9 different reservoir schemes that are being planned over the next sort of 10, 20 years. So, we will start to see different infrastructure is needed. I think the other thing that we will have to consider is things like avoiding the use of hard surfaces, where we can, to sort of use those opportunities to look for sustainable drainage opportunities and to avoid all the water that does fall on us running into the sewage system, causing problems there. So, a much more holistic approach to planning and to the provision of water and sewage services is also going to be needed.
Well, that's an interesting point because, wetter winters that may on the face of it look like a good thing from a water resource planning, actually, as you've just said, could be a bad thing in terms of the drainage system and implications on storm overflow usage, which clearly is something that we've got to make sure we get a grip of and we see that driving down. So, that challenge of keeping surface water out of sewers is a huge one, and probably not one we're going to address on this episode of Waterfall. I do think as well, when you look at wetter winters, you got to look at the wider context, because winters may be getting wetter, but summers are getting very much hotter. We've just had the hottest summer on record, and obviously who can forget those record-breaking temperatures that we saw back in 2022 when the UK broke the 40-degree barrier. It was unbelievable for the first time. And obviously heat waves have a massive impact on water demand. So you may find, is it getting a bit easier in the winter? But actually it's getting much harder in the summer. So that wider context, I think this is what you were alluding to when you were talking about a holistic approach as well, because you've got to look at the full year. You can't just look at one season in isolation.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And, as we've talked, on Waterfall before, there are ways that we can all play a part in this. And it doesn't take a lot of effort. There are some really simple things that everybody can do. And it would be good to think that people are starting to see that if we all did a few simple saving tips around the house, we could make a big collective difference,
Well, I've clearly got to ask you what your favorite water saving tip is around the house. And you're not allowed to say turn off the tap when you brush your teeth, even though that does save a family of 4 over £100 a year for doing literally nothing.
Exactly. I suppose the thing that I am continuing to do, and I am a woman on a mission, is I always keep a jug by the side of the kitchen sink so that I pour any water into that I'm either using or emptying from the kettle or something like that. And that's, it once you start to see how much water you're just collecting by doing, a few simple things, it makes you realise just how much water you could potentially save. So
What do
yeah,
you do with that
that's,
water, Karen?
well, water the plants when it's dry, and I use it on the garden. So I'm certainly not ever watering my lawn. I avoid doing that at all costs because it just bounces back as soon as it is.
Oh, you should see my lawn, Karen, right now. My lawn is more of a football pitch in the back garden for the girls, but it's unbelievably healthy now.
Yeah.
And it was in a right old state just a few months ago. And obviously we're talking in August 2025. But I need to put a picture of that on social media just to kind of remind people that you can leave you alone. But that's a really good point. I've been doing something this year which I hadn't previously been doing. And actually it's similar to something that Tony V, who is one of the listeners who's been on the show, had talked about using the condensate from air conditioning. And whilst I don't have air conditioning, we do have a dehumidifier and it collects the water. And I thought I'd been really clever by using that water from the dehumidifier for a flush in the toilet. But the design of the dehumidifier is so poor that when I went to flush to pour the water out of the dehumidifier into the toilet, it's just not built for pouring out. It's like a design flaw. And literally there's water went everywhere. So I didn't manage to, it didn't really do the job in terms of a proper flush. And also most of it went over the floor. So then I had to mop up said water.
Yeah.
I'm sure I used more water cleaning up the mess that I made with this water. So I need to enhance my technique on pouring out the condensate from a dehumidifier. But that was, a good few liters of water in there. It wasn't, it's not just like 100 mils. It was like a good 4 or 5 liters of water. And it's things like that actually, as you say, Karen, when you see it, you see that volume of water. And when you visually see what it takes to mop up that water once you throw it over the floor, it does really highlight though just how much water we use.
One of the things that I do is I've got a shower over my bath, and so when I'm running the taps to heat to the right temperature for my shower, I collect that water in a bucket, and that saves me a huge amount of water, which again, as you say, I use to flush the toilet. And as I say, it doesn't take any effort.
No, very good. And well, that brings us to our final question, really, which is, what is your personal water use? Now, last time we asked you, it was pretty impressive. It was one of the lowest figures that we've heard. So I don't know if you have an update for us.
I do actually. So as I say, I am a woman on a mission. I am out to prove my credentials in this area. I'm currently using, on average, 48 litres a day.
No. Wow. I think we've only ever had one sub 50 litre guest before.
Well, no, we had somebody who got even lower than me.
Yeah. Sorry, but that was, it wasn't Mark Gush, the guy from Royal Horticultural Society.
No, it was Laura Moss.
Laura Moss from Drinking Water Spectre on the Waterfall Live edition, which is a very good edition. Please do check that out. Well, anyway, irrespective of whether you are the lowest, that is a massively impressive figure, Karen. That's amazing. Well, all your techniques really work.
But interestingly, that still adds up to over 1,300 litres a month.
Yeah, it's a lot. Wow. Right. Karen, that is impressive. Thank you as ever for joining us on Waterfall. Now, I've got my fingers crossed. I've got everything crossed for a wet winter this winter season and every year. Don't forget to check out our extensive back catalogue of episodes. We've got some fabulous episodes out there. Do check them out. And if you're short on time, we've got some mini versions of Waterfall available. So they go straight to the point without any of our waffle. If you like what you hear, please do subscribe to Waterfall so you'll never miss an episode. Also, please leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. Now, apparently, I don't really know what this means, but apparently reviews really matter for the algorithm. There you go. I think this algorithm points lots of people to Waterfall. So leave us a review, preferably a kind one. Finally, we'd love to hear from you. Email us at podcast@ccw.org.uk and check us out on our social media feeds. We're at CCW Voice. So that's it for this edition of Waterfall. Join us again soon for our next deep dive into the world of water.